king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 212 Rewards and New Ranks. After his impassioned speech, Marin went backstage to drink a glass of water and take a breath, while also letting the audience digest the content of his speech. What Marin didn't know was that among the audience present today, there were several bards. These people's profession was to tell stories to attract audiences in exchange for rewards. The story that Marin told himself was too legendary and inspirational. Therefore, these bards secretly wrote down the story that Marin told, and planned to use it in their future speeches and storytelling. You know, in their line of work, stories also need to be constantly updated. Everyone has heard the night legends they usually tell. Now, a legendary version of a real-life story is in front of them. If they don't use it, they will be sorry for their profession. Later, when these bards were wandering in Germany, they spread the story of Marin, which caused a huge sensation. Many years later, the haystack behind the monastery in the small town of Kassel, where Marin once slept, became a holy place in the hearts of all wandering knights in Germany. Because it was here that the great mercenary king Marin was blessed by God and eventually rose to prominence. Therefore, many wandering knights went to spend the night in the haystack behind Kassel Abbey. They did so for no other reason than to seek the elusive opportunity, hoping that like Marin, they could be blessed with wisdom by God and become great military strategists, and even better, have a good life as a king. Kassel Abbey also sensed a business opportunity and copied 19 or 20 haystacks of the same type that Marin had slept on, lining them up behind the abbey and opening them up for business. Each haystack was charged 1 shilling for one night's sleep. Without further ado, after Marin had rested enough, he immediately presided over a reward ceremony to reward the meritorious soldiers who had helped him capture East Frisia. However, the first person he rewarded was not any meritorious soldier, but Adler, who signed a document declaring that he would give up his inheritance rights. Strictly speaking, although Adler did not have any military merit, he voluntarily gave up his inheritance rights, which made it meaningful for Marin to send troops. Otherwise, Marin would have no legal basis. Everyone understands this point very well, because from the Middle Ages to modern times in Europe, orthodoxy was very important, even stricter than in ancient China. In China, because Chen Sheng and Wu Guang started the trend and shouted out the famous saying, "Our kings, princes, generals, and ministers born of different species," the change of dynasties in China depends entirely on strength. But it was different in Europe, where no serf uprising had ever been successful. Therefore, in Europe, there would be wars of annexation between nobles, but it was very rare for a commoner to rise up and become a king. Therefore, in Europe, the concept of aristocratic blood is deeply rooted in people's minds. If someone without aristocratic blood wants to be king, there is a great chance that he will be beaten to death by a group of people. Therefore, the thrones of Europe were often obtained through inheritance and marriage. Of course, the emperor, pope and king were also qualified to confer titles on someone as a prince. However, this was relatively rare, because to confer titles on someone as a duke or earl required a lot of territory, and generally speaking, the emperor, pope and king were reluctant to do so. The canonization of Adler was agreed upon before. Therefore, Marin did not hesitate at all and directly issued an order to canonize Adler as the Baron of Lier, with a fief of 5,000 ugrams, just outside the county of Lille. Among them, 2,000 ugrams were arable land, and they were all very fertile arable land. The other 3,000 ugrams were made up of grasslands, woods and lakes. Such a fiefdom might not be considered large in terms of arable land area, but considering that it was all high-quality fertile land, Adler's fiefdom was still quite good. Adler walked forward cheerfully, intending to kneel down, swear allegiance to Marin with his hand on the Bible, and receive the documents. But Marin stopped him and announced in public that Adler did not have to kneel down to swear, and was allowed to stand to swear. This is a special favor, limited to Adler's generation, and his descendants cannot enjoy this honor. Moreover, Adler will not need to kneel down to Marin in any occasion in the future. This is mainly because Marin's soul is Chinese after all. The eldest brother is like a father, and Marin was taken care of by his brother when he was a child in his previous life. Even after traveling through time, he believed that there was no reason for an elder brother to kneel down to his younger brother. In addition, Adler was willing to give up his inheritance rights, so Marin gave Adler this privilege, which was valid for life. Adler was very grateful for the courtesy given to him by Marin, so he stood up sincerely and swore allegiance to Marin. After the allegiance, Marin announced that he would fund the construction of a castle for Adler in his fiefdom outside the county town of Lier. This was also a very generous treatment, because building a castle would cost a lot of money. Even building an ordinary castle would cost tens of thousands of gold coins, which would take an ordinary baron many years to save. Once the castle is built, it will be time for Adler to go to Lier. Beside him, Adler's wife Liv was so happy that she couldn't stop smiling. Although she was dissatisfied with Marin for taking away Adler's inheritance rights before, after listening to Marin's magical story just now, she understood that Marin's adventures and magical abilities were not something her husband Adler could have. She was already very satisfied with the 2,000 ugrams of fertile farmland she had obtained. As for the other 3,000 ugrams of grassland, woods, and lakes, they were purely a pleasant surprise. The biggest surprise was the castle, which would have cost thousands or even 10,000 or 20,000 gold coins. I was so happy to save that. Moreover, what made Liv happy the most was that old Hoffman and Lady Mary would live in Auric with her brother-in-law and sister-in-law. Then, it would be Liv, not Lady Mary, who would be the hostess of the castle in Lisle County. And given Adler's obedient character towards Liv, when she arrived at Lisle, wasn't she still the female overlord of the barony? Liv was so beautiful that she didn't have to pretend to be a lady and a good wife in front of her parents-in-law. Next, it is time to reward the soldiers who attacked East Frisia. Kahn was ranked first because he led the charge and opened the Emden Gate first, while Schwartz and Frundsberg were ranked first because of their achievements in attacking Auric and Lair. For these three people, Marin appointed them as barons and rewarded each of them with 2,000 ugrams of land, half of which was arable land. What is a baronet? This is something that Marin and later generations of British people learned. The baronet appeared in 1611. It was a new title, invented by King James I of England to raise funds. It was used to make money and could be purchased. The baronet in the UK is more of an honorary position, without actual fiefdom, but the title can be inherited. But Marin brought out the baronet title more than 100 years earlier. However, Marin's baronet does have fiefdom. Moreover, Marin not only established the title of baronet, but also the title of vice-baron. The specific levels are, baron is higher than vice-baron, and vice-baron is higher than baronet. In other words, Marin divided a baron into 3 levels. Moreover, the standards for each level were also set. For example, the fiefdom standard for a baron was 2,000 ugrams of arable land, the fiefdom standard for a vice-baron was 1,500 ugrams of arable land, and the fiefdom standard for a junior baron was 1,000 ugrams of arable land. In addition, Marin also added the viscount, which was not common in the German region, which was also divided into 3 levels, viscount, deputy viscount and junior viscount. The reason for this is to facilitate the reward of generals. If according to the custom in the German region, there are only counts and barons, and after this battle, Schwartz and Frundsberg will be awarded barons, then next time they make meritorious deeds, will they also be awarded counts. But Marin himself is a count. Therefore, Marin thought about it and established 6 levels of noble titles below the earl. Moreover, Marin also imitated some regions and established hereditary knights and knights. Hereditary knights and hereditary knights have higher status than non-hereditary knights and knights, but they also belong to the lower nobility, and are distinguished from high nobility such as barons by castration. The reason why Marin established hereditary knights and hereditary knights was actually to reward those brave soldiers. Officers can be rewarded with baron titles, but brave soldiers can't also be awarded barons, right? Therefore, Marin simply divided the knight class into 2 levels, hereditary knights, knights of 3 generations and ordinary knights. In this way, Marin will have a lot of room to reward his soldiers. Soldier, you fought bravely, didn't you? Very well, I will make you a common knight. What? You killed the enemy's officer. That's a bigger achievement, right? Very well, I'll make you the 3rd generation knight. Ah. You killed the enemy general. Fine. I'll make you a hereditary knight, and all your descendants will be nobles. Are you satisfied now? In other words, in order to reward soldiers, the Marin County established 6 high-level titles, Viscount, Vice-Viscount, Viscount, Baron, Vice-Baron and Baron, as well as 3 low-level titles, Hereditary Knight, 3rd-Generation Knight and Knight. At the same time, in order to reward civil servants, 3 low-level titles, Hereditary Knight, 3rd-Generation Knight and Ordinary Knight were also established. In short, the more titles one has, the easier it is to reward subordinates, and the greater the room for promotion. However, not all titles have corresponding fiefs. A knight is not given a fiefdom, and neither is a knight necessarily. Only if one has made enough military achievements will the title be given the corresponding fiefdom. Even high-ranking titles may not necessarily have fiefs. Marin stipulated that only those titles obtained through military merit would be given corresponding fiefs. Moreover, if the military merits were not great enough, the corresponding fiefs might not be obtained. In addition to being obtained through military merit, high-ranking titles can also be conferred on civil officials. However, civil officials who are conferred high-ranking titles are not given corresponding fiefs. The titles bestowed upon civil officials would be preceded by a modifier, of the court. For example, the baron, the corresponding civil servant can be granted the title of court baron, court vice baron and court baronet. However, as long as the word court is added, it means that there is no corresponding fiefdom, but it can be inherited or you can buy land yourself. But it is not a fiefdom, and you have to pay taxes normally. Through the newly established 6 levels of high-level titles and 3 levels of low-level titles, Marin fully met the soldiers' demands for rewards. Using the simple division method of seating seats and eating fruits, he granted corresponding titles and lands to all meritorious soldiers. However, because the land area of East Frisia is small, Marin is rather stingy in giving fiefs. But for the soldiers who were not given fiefs, Marin generally gave a lot of money as compensation, allowing them to buy land by themselves. However, the land bought by the soldiers themselves will have to pay taxes in the future. In this way, Marin tried his best to avoid the loss of taxes in the future. Because every time Marin gave out a piece of territory, it meant that this piece of land would not have to pay taxes in the future. Therefore, Marin was very calculative about the issue of fiefs, and would rather give cash than give fiefs easily. Marin personally conferred high-ranking titles on only a few people. In addition to Adler, Kahn, Schwartz, and Frundsberg, Marin also conferred Kohler as a court baronet and Geoffrey as a court baronet. But in order to compensate Kohler, Marin privately gave Kohler a fief of 1,000 ugrams, but it was not made public. As for the awards for the lower-ranking soldiers, Marin left them to Schwartz and Frundsberg to present. He himself went to slack off. By the way, he went to tease the beautiful Angela who had just arrived from Denburg. Chapter 213, Confrontation on the Western Front. In the southwestern border area of West Frisia, troops were stationed here to guard against the army of the former Frisian nobles who had fled not long ago. Several former Frisian nobles were not stupid. When they heard that the enemy had mobilized 4,000 troops, they agreed to Marin's original suggestion without thinking, to run away. When the Saxon army arrived at the southwest border, the 2,000 soldiers of the former Frisian nobles all withdrew into the Duchy of Geddes, taking with them a large amount of food and livestock. However, they also robbed the locals of their food and property, leaving behind a group of local people with nothing. After the Saxon army arrived at the border, they wanted to collect food locally according to the rules of the Middle Ages, but there was no food at all. The locals were digging wild vegetables and fishing from the freshwater river. Prince George had no choice but to send people to other places to collect grain. Now that the autumn harvest had just ended, the granaries in various places were full, and it was easy to collect grain. At the same time, Prince George was not stupid. He realized that the enemy might have fled into the Principality of Guedes. However, the Principality of Guedes was not a weak country. If Saxony mobilized fully, it would certainly be able to suppress the Principality of Guedes. However, West Frisia was too far away from Saxony, and it was impossible to mobilize enough troops to suppress the Principality of Guedes. Even the tens of thousands of troops that attacked West Frisia last time were only assembled by borrowing a few thousand men from the Elector of Saxony. Normally, George could mobilize at most 5,000 soldiers to participate in the war in West Frisia. Therefore, facing the Principality of Guedes, George was also under pressure. Therefore, he did not pursue into the Principality of Guedes easily, but sent envoys to the Principality of Guedes, requesting the other party to allow him to lead troops into the Principality of Guedes to wipe out the roaming rebels. But while he was waiting for the reply from the Principality of Guedes, a very explosive news suddenly came from the east: the owner of the county of East Frisia had changed. Marin blockaded Emden for 10 days, but Emden was a busy commercial port after all. So, after 10 days, Marin realized that the blockade could not be sustained, so he lifted the blockade. Then, the news began to spread slowly. When the Saxon officials in Groningen heard the news, they first sent people to Emden to inquire about the news, and then sent people to report to George at the front line. "Tell me, what's going on?" "It's like this. At the end of last month, someone discovered that the trade in Emden port seemed to have stopped. No one knew what was going on. And a few days ago, when merchants went to Emden to trade, they found that the flag on the top of Emden city had been changed." "Changed? Which noble family did it? Did you see it clearly?" "They are not foreign nobles, but people from East Frisia." "Someone inside? Is it a rebellion?" "It is not a rebellion, Your Highness. Have you ever heard of the Block family in East Frisia? The Bullock family? I've heard of them. Wasn't that the family that ruled East Frisia more than 60 years ago?" "Yes, it was the descendants of that family who fought back. It is said that they killed all the descendants of the nobles who participated in the rebellion, and the whole Emden was flooded with blood." "Well, what is your name now, Earl?" Your Highness, you may not even guess who he is. Stop talking nonsense. Who is it? If you keeping me in suspense, I'll send someone to beat you with a stick. Yes, that person is Baron Varden, Marin. What? It's him. Isn't his last name Hoffman? How did he become the heir of the Bullock family? It's like this. Marin Hoffman's mother is the granddaughter of the last Earl of Block. And his mother is the only branch of the Block family left. So, Marin Hoffman is indeed the heir of the Block family. Impossible. Marin Hoffman was born a wandering knight. That means he has an older brother. Even if his mother is the heir, the title cannot be inherited by Marin Hoffman. You are right, he does have an older brother. However, his older brother has already signed a document giving up his inheritance rights. I see. But East Frisia is a territory that the old man has long had his eyes on. This kid actually dared to compete with our Wettin family for food. By the way, how many soldiers does this guy have? How long did it take to capture Emden? Prince George suddenly thought of an important question. The Duke of Saxony had set his sights on East Frisia before, and planned to find an opportunity to annex East Frisia in the future. However, East Frisia suddenly changed its owner, and Prince George wanted to know how strong Marin's army was and whether it was easy to annex. Well, I don't know the exact number of Marin Hoffman's troops. However, Emden had 1,400 defenders before. Among them, 1,000 were powerful straw hat swordsmen. Therefore, Marin Hoffman's troops must be more than 3,000. Otherwise, he couldn't defeat Emden. If there are 3,000 people, we still have a chance to take over East Frisia. Now, we can take advantage of the fact that he has not yet established a firm foothold and mobilize a large army from the mainland to seize East Frisia. However, if there are more troops, it will be troublesome. Hatch, Prince George's adjutant, you will stay at the border with 2,000 men and wait for the Duke of Guise's reply. I will take 2,000 men back first and go to the East Frisian border to take a look. Your Highness, what are you going to do? 2,000 men are not enough to attack East Frisia. I know. I just take people to station at the East Frisian border to deter the other side. By the way, scare Marin, and then, the most important thing is to see how many troops it can mobilize to confront me. George said confidently. How many troops will be mobilized? Yes, now that my army is approaching, the enemy will certainly be nervous and will withdraw its main force to guard against us. At that time, we will be able to see at a glance the size of the enemy's main force and the appearance of the army. We will know at a glance whether it is a strong army or not. Prince George is not stupid. So, he decided to use a very simple trick to test the current strength of East Frisia and the speed of the enemy's reaction. If East Frisia is weak, then the Duchy of Saxony would not mind sending troops again to take over a large area of territory. But if the opponent is very strong, then they may have to give up first. After all, the Wettin family will not do anything that does not give them an advantage. A few days later, Prince George appeared outside the western border of East Frisia with 2,000 soldiers and began to set up camp. When the news reached Auric, Marin was shocked. What? Saxon troops? Are you sure? How many of them? There are only 2,000 people, but the one leading them is Prince George, the commander of the Duchy of Saxony stationed in Friesland. And, strangely, Prince George did not launch an attack. He seemed to be waiting for something. Wait for reinforcements? No, Saxony only has 5,000 soldiers here. Should we mobilize troops from Saxony itself? But that's not right. There's no need for this bastard to send people to the west to alert the enemy. After thinking for a long time, Marin slapped his head. I understand. He is trying to spy on us. Now that he understood this, Marin decided not to be polite. He was not willing to go to war with the Duchy of Saxony. So, he decided to show off his strength to Prince George. Geoffrey, how many troops can be mobilized from the entire territory of East Frisia now, as quickly as possible? Ah. My Lord Earl, there is going to be a war again. Geoffrey was a civil servant and was most afraid of war. No, the Saxons in the west are provoking me at the border. I am going to gather enough troops to scare them. I see. Geoffrey patted his chest and breathed a sigh of relief. Sir, of the 6,000 soldiers you received, 1,250 went to the east, 1,250 went to the south. There are also 1,250 people in the west. That means I still have more than 2,000 people to mobilize. That's not the case. You know, there is already a phalanx on the western border. If you bring another 2,000 people there, wouldn't that be an army of more than 3,000? And don't forget, there are still 600 straw hat swordsmen and more than 2,000 prisoners of war who participated in the rebellion of the rural nobles who have not yet been released. Originally, you planned to lock them up for a while and then release them. 600 straw hat swordsmen, more than 2,000 prisoners. Those 600 straw hat swordsmen are definitely elite, but they are not very reassuring. As for the 2,000 prisoners, they can fill in the numbers. By the way, if we mobilize, how many people can we mobilize? The entire East Frisia can still mobilize 5,000 to 6,000 people. However, it will take half a month. Why weren't these people mobilized to fight me before? Sir, even if they are mobilized, they still need officers to command them. Do you know that the commanders of these mobilized soldiers are all among the original 1,000 straw hat swordsmen? These 1,000 straw hat swordsmen are both elite soldiers and grassroots officers. Without officers to command them, it is useless to mobilize the mobilized soldiers. Then keep the 600 straw hat swordsmen in captivity, and send the other 2,000 prisoners with the army. These guys are all officers. If we let them come into contact with the mobilized soldiers, wouldn't they be able to take action right away? It's too dangerous. We can't let these guys go now. We have to wait until things stabilize. Also, Jeffrey, you must mobilize able-bodied men in the surrounding areas as quickly as possible. I will give you 2 days to mobilize as many as you can. After 2 days, I will lead the army to the western border. Yes. 2 days later, Marin left 300 men to guard Auric. He led 2,000 original main forces, 2,000 prisoners, and 1,700 temporarily mobilized soldiers to the western border. On the EMS River, Marin's men collected enough boats and built several pontoon bridges on the river to allow the army to cross the river. To the west of the EMS River, there is an area of nearly 200 square kilometers belonging to East Frisia. At this time, the original garrison here, under the command of Frundsberg who had arrived earlier, had all crossed the river and confronted the Saxon army outside the border. When Prince George of Saxony climbed up to the top and saw thousands of troops rushing over from the other side of the river, his face changed drastically. Where does this bastard get so many troops? Oh, this guy is a mercenary, he can't be hired, right? But does this guy have so much money to support so many people? Marin's main force crossed the river very quickly and in an orderly manner, but the crossing of the more than 3,000 East Frisian native troops behind was somewhat chaotic and inefficient. Marin had no time to care about those mobilized soldiers with low combat effectiveness. After arranging some people to coordinate and command, he led 2,000 main forces forward and formed a formation with the original phalanx. Marin's main force had all been strictly trained. Therefore, they lined up very quickly and soon reached the border, forming a very tight defense line with Frundsberg's troops. The speed and discipline made Prince George sweat profusely. As expected of a man who can defeat the King of France, he is really good at training his troops. But what's wrong with the army at the back? They took so long to cross the river. I understand, those are conscripts. That is to say, the enemy's elite troops, including the more than 1,000 before, have more than 3,000, and the conscripts are also more than 3,000, a total of more than 6,000 people. Damn, that's too many. George swallowed. That's not all. 3 days later, the 4th phalanx from the southern border was also transferred here. They were replaced by a conscripted army. Since there was no hostility with the bishopric of Munster, conscripted soldiers were enough. Seeing that Marin had mobilized another elite phalanx, George continued to swallow his saliva, and his hands were shaking a little. A week later, the Eastern Front troops also arrived, and they were replaced by 2,000 conscripts. Seeing the 5,000 or 6,000 elite troops lined up in front of him, plus more than 3,000 conscripts, the total number was almost 10,000. Prince George was so scared that his legs went weak. If a fight really broke out, his 5,000 men would not be a match. Fortunately, Marin was also afraid of the powerful strength of the Saxon family, so he did not take the initiative to attack, but just demonstrated. Otherwise, Prince George and his 2,000 men would all be finished. Prince George also understood this, so he led his men away in a panic, but he left with a huge psychological shadow. And Marin, after achieving his goal of scaring his opponent, also led his army back to the court.